Upon knowing that world before us, manicured with such fortresses as feet once knew, and school kids flitting twixt brine and bubble, learned residue, our guesses for worlds after us, before us, seem reflected in that sea glass compositions. That fellow with the fins might prompt a train, brain-like hollow coral cobblestones. Keep the sea star for an architect, keep the Technicolor realm untelevised. That quiet, that time, perhaps just an introvert's paradise.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Solacene. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Jeanne Villepreux-Power, and thank you, Erin, for always starting us off with such a lovely poem. This one was especially great, might I say so? What was the inspiration for this poem?
The inspiration was, as usual, the subject of the episode, this lady who is notable, amongst other things, for inventing the aquarium. And you know I love aquariums and tiny aquatic creatures. You know I've had what we've detailed in many an episode prior, boat lust, and this kind of comes upon my life in fits and spurts, and currently I'm really in the midst of some boat lust. And so I was really drawing the parallel, poetically, I like to think, between aquariums and how they present this tiny, almost television-like but three-dimensional world, curated and manicured and populated with whatever its owner wants to populate it with, and what we do with the Solacene, which is design and in some way manifest every week a utopian future. So yeah, aquariums and utopias. It's one and the same.
Yeah, the aquarium is a living diorama and Solacene is a vocal diorama, one could say.
It's also like, I mentioned the sea star and coral. These things seem so alien and so ancient, and I'm not alone, but they're so creatively inspiring. It's a little bit of a divergence from last week when we talk about Harambe, and I said part of the reason he was so captured the imagination so much, I think, is because he was a monkey, and obviously humans and monkeys have this special relationship. It's almost like that, but kind of the opposite, where because they are so far detached from us evolutionarily, it makes me think of not the far past, but the far future. So
for sure, yeah, the ocean still seems like a frontier. I know it's been explored, but I feel like it's been explored by such a handful of people. Whereas nature has, it seems, been explored by a wider variety of people.
Land.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because the likes of you or I have never really seen, like when you go underwater in the ocean, you close your eyes for the most part. So you don't see this stuff unless it's on television. And then it may as well be as invented as like the Twilight Zone or something like that.
True. And it also requires specialized equipment, whereas going on a hike for the most part doesn't.
So for this semester, what we're doing is each episode will focus on an individual, usually historical, usually an inspiration to one or both of us. And we will try and draw lessons from their life in a way that is part biographical, but maybe a little bit more so theoretical or thematic, viewing them more as case studies, maybe for what they represent, or different lessons we can learn and pull from their lives to design the Solacene. So for Jeanne Villepreux-Power, who is actually notable in this semester, I guess is a weird thing to admit to start the episode, in that neither of us knew of her before we decided to cover her, whereas everyone else has been somebody that we've researched or read about, or at least kind of peripherally were aware of, like Theodore Roosevelt's. She was, to be honest, the result of me searching for notable female inventors or something like that, or famous women in science. And I guess that's a little bit of a shallow way to find a subject, but one, we felt like we should have some kind of gender balance during the semester, and two, as we'll probably get into, it goes almost without saying, but a lot of famous women in history have kind of been minimized to the point that you don't know their names. Whereas ordinarily, maybe you would. She'd be more of a household name.
Yeah, more than anyone else, I think we will get into her actual biography because it's quite interesting and deserves more widespread recognition, I believe.
A deep dive, some might say.
Yeah, a deep dive. And out of all of the people we've covered so far, she's the most inspiring one personally.
Oh, nice.
Which I'm excited to talk a bit about as one half of the population of the soul scene at the moment. I think if I resonate with her quite a lot, then
yeah,
that's a good thing for the soul scene.
The woman half.
Yes. So, Jeanne was born in the middle of the French Revolution, 1794, in rural France, which is a very long time ago when it comes to female inventors, because until 1945, women weren't even allowed in a lot of scientific societies, universities, and so on. So for her to have rose to global recognition and been quite formative in the field of natural science, then round of applause to her. So she was born in 1794, 100 miles from the coast of France. So during her childhood, she had no exposure to the ocean. She just lived in a normal, rural, farming area.
Provincial town, some might say.
Mm-hmm. Fortunately, her mother really valued education and knew how to read and taught Jeanne how to read, write, educated her at home. They were so rural that there were no schools even, so had her mom not taken the initiative, she wouldn't have been educated, would have just been educated in the womanly ways of sewing and so on.
No schools, and also no schools of fish.
No schools of fish, for sure. And then, interestingly enough, when she turned 17, she left home to go to Paris, as every great heroine does. And she actually walked 200 miles to get to Paris. She didn't take the train. She didn't take the metro. She just walked on her own 2 feet, 200 miles to go to Paris to work as a seamstress. See, step one of how I resonate with her. Also a seamstress.
Yeah, in the Paris of North America.
Say right. So, in Paris, she worked as a seamstress and rose to such acclaim that after the defeat of Napoleon, the French king was regaining authority. He was newly appointed, and he was trying to do a lot of those fairy tale dealings of marrying people to try and have these relationships that are good for the government. So he was marrying his nephew with a Sicilian princess, and for that royal wedding, the first royal wedding of this new regime, Jeanne was actually asked to make the wedding dress for the princess. That's one of my goals now, is to be asked to make a wedding dress for a princess. And so at the wedding, because Jeanne was actually invited, she didn't just make the dress and have to sit at home. She was allowed to come. She met her husband. So he was obviously of some notoriety. He wasn't just a random peasant. She kind of married up, as they say.
It sounds like a film. I know I'm too much of an indoor kid and I talk too much about movies ordinarily, but I really think this sounds like a Disney movie, and perhaps it was because of some Disney movies, maybe some of her notoriety went into some of those stories. I don't know, but because that's the first act. The long walk, the starting from nothing, going to getting invited to the wedding, and then meeting the Prince Charming.
Well, he's Irish.
Yeah.
That's why his last name is Power.
Okay.
And then he, was in Sicily as a merchant. And yes. So I guess you could call him a Prince Charming.
Merchants are fun.
Yes.
Back in the day, you could meet people, be a hub, a spoke.
Yeah. So they met, they fell in love. Yeah, very romantic. And they moved to Sicily. Poor Jeanne had to move to this lovely town called Messina, right on the coast, beautiful nature. And she was so excited to finally be near the ocean, because her whole life she had really been quite isolated from the ocean.
It sounds a little bit less like you were inspired and more like you're just envious.
Perhaps. Some could say that. And when she moved, she didn't have to work anymore because he was so rich. So she started going on lots of walks. Mooches, as I call them. The 19th century mooch. So she walked around Sicily and started collecting samples of nature, seashells, and so on, just out of curiosity. And then she was like, there's books. but all of the books back then were mainly in Latin, all of the more academic texts. So she starts learning Latin. She starts learning a bunch of different languages because she's obviously French, but then her husband's English and Sicilian, so he's like Italian and English. So she starts just learning languages so that she could communicate better and so that she could read these texts. And I feel like this is a good opportunity for the first Solacene lesson.
I think so too. What I would say is it's about prioritizing above all else the world around you, and also something about the fact that you don't have to have lofty aims, ambitions, and scope all the time. It can just be like, I want to learn the name of every type of rock, tree, bird, insect, squid on and around this island, and I'm going to list it, and I'm going to make a pretty drawing of each. And actually, this is relevant to both today's episode and next week. I was curious what it means to be a naturalist, because we also threw the word around when we were talking about Roosevelt, and it seems like such a slightly outdated role or profession, and two, such a kind of unattainable thing for someone living in a city and speaking into a microphone. It's like, how can you be a naturalist unless you be like SpongeBob Nature Pants and throw your spatula to the floor, rip off your square suit, and go and join the jellies? How can you do so? Well, the definition of naturalist just says an expert in or a student of natural history. So I think this lesson is kind of like, in a sense, it's humility to just say, I don't have to contribute anything to a scientific canon. I just want to learn, partially for the sake of learning, partially for myself, partially, it may help here or there, but it's primarily the joy of knowing your surroundings.
Exactly. She didn't set out with the intention of making any discoveries, inventions. She just was like, these are cool shells. Yeah, exactly. I want them in my closet, so I take them. And yeah, as we've been talking about, like, as you said, Teddy Roosevelt and a lot of other historical scientists, they learned from nature. They used nature as a teacher, and I'm starting to reread Braiding Sweetgrass and forgot how big of a theme that is in that book. The author of that book, Robin Wall Kimmerer, she went into biology after years and years of being a naturalist as a kid and as a teenager. Yeah. And they were like, you can't just say these things about nature without having used the right tools, the right techniques to measure it. And she came to kind of understand, there's a scientific method, but there's also nature can just tell us things by watching it and paying attention. And now we'll move on in the biography because that'll get into her techniques as she started to kind of systematize her interests. Traditionally, natural scientists, natural historians, they had these cabinets of curiosities. So they would go out and they would collect samples. They would sometimes collect live samples and put them into bottles of formaldehyde or what have you to preserve them. Oh, it's a pickled eyeball. Exactly. So it's what you picture, the pickled eyeball, like the unicorn horn that they actually captured from a narwhal, all of these things. So that's what the natural historians would do. They'd have these cabinets, they'd go in, they'd study them dead. They'd always be dead. And then Jeanne was like, I like living things. I want pets. That's what she said to James. And Jeanne started to form her own cabinet of curiosities. But as the open-minded, creative individual she was, she developed her own fixative, which is like the stuff you can use to preserve animals. So one day she gets home. She has captured a turtle. I'm out of fixative. I'm just going to put this turtle into a bottle of alcohol until the next day when I have my fixative to pour him in, because alcohol is like a low-level preservative or what have you. It's like turtle vodka or something. Yeah. Turtle whiskey. She wakes up the next morning. The turtle is just roaming around the house. It had crawled out of the bottle, probably a little bit tipsy, It had crawled out of the jar of alcohol, and she was like, excuse me? Why are you alive? Because it shouldn't be alive. And then she realized, she started talking to people, turtles are very resilient to a lot of different really extreme temperatures. And then she was like, you got that one up on me, and kept the turtle as a pet. This is the first of many pets for Jeanne. Can I ask you something? Yes. If you were to have a cabinet of curiosities,
either thrust upon you or something that you built yourself, what's one thing that you would want in there? For me, I would want some kind of dried, because I think everything is usually wet or gelatinous or bubbling. I want something like a beef jerky, but make it seaweed or something like that.
Okay.
Some crusty texture.
That makes sense. Some dried coral.
Yeah, but a little bit thinner. It could even be like, you know how instead of doors, like the door to my cabinet would be, instead of a regular thing that you slide or pull open with a handle, it would be like those curtains that are just beads, but instead of beads, it would be seaweeds.
Okay.
Or something.
Fun. I would like some kind of a crystal.
Yeah.
Like an ocean pearl or something like that.
Okay.
I do like shiny things.
I would like some kind of really precious jewel or gem.
For me, just whatever, 20 carat diamond.
I'll just take
to be lying around.
20 carats. Pickled.
Yeah. Do you want to know what she named the turtle?
What's that guy from Finding Nemo? Spike?
She named it Mignon. Not very creative.
Oh, cute.
She named it cute.
Okay.
But she did train it to come when called, which is...
That sounds like a lie.
That might be a bit of a... Because this is what I was thinking. This is the next transformation into a Disney princess. She has the...
Well, yeah. She had these two other pets, beach martins, which are kind of like these little Weasley things. I just imagine her kind of strolling the ocean or like clicking her fingers, and then they would come and sit on her shoulder like Nausicaa, something like that.
Yeah,
except they were nocturnal, I think. But
she was so into these beach martins that she literally got a whole tree inside of her house and birds inside of her house for them to hunt, so that she could observe their hunting patterns.
Yeah, you know that wizard from Lord of the Rings?
Mm-hmm.
The brown one.
Yeah.
I feel like she's kind of like him.
Radagast.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she just started in her house kind of turning it into a dry aquarium.
Yeah.
I guess you could say an ecosystem in itself. And she started observing the animals, because in nature you couldn't really observe their hunting patterns because it's hard to track them down. But in here she could watch them and take notes. She then started befriending fishermen to show her cool animals. So the fishermen would go out and they'd maybe capture a weird snail and they'd bring it to her and be like, hey, look at this. So she started having that relationship. And then she wanted to start observing these aquatic creatures in her house because it's hard to observe them in the natural environment. But then she realized that the water becomes very dirty, so you have to constantly replace it. And she wanted to start studying octopuses, which apparently are infamous for being really hard to keep in aquariums. Even today, in the big aquariums, they're really hard to keep. So she developed this apparatus, I suppose, a slated box, which she would capture this certain type of octopus and put inside of them and sit on her boat and lean down and watch them do their thing.
Yeah, so it was basically an offshore tiny research lab. I think one of the first in the world, because I was looking into a little bit of the history of aquariums, and it's kind of like through ancient times, it's not like people never had fish in controlled environments, but as far as I can tell, it was never for scientific purpose. And it was also, they would never quite tweak the parameters of said controlled environments to, consciously to suit the organisms they'd keep. It would be more like, we have a pond that we keep pretty protected, and we have koi fish in there and we're breeding them or something like that. Exactly. But it's a very different prospect, right?
For sure. And this brings us to the second lesson of the Solacene, and that is thinking outside of the box, because these specific octopus that she was studying for hundreds and, dare I say, thousands of years, they were thought to be these octopuses. They're the only one that have shells. And weirdly enough, they're not attached to their shells. So they're similar to hermit crabs in that way, but hermit crabs steal their shells, obviously. People thought that these guys also stole their shells because they're not attached. They're kind of a weird shape. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I saw the pictures. They look like
hats.
They look a little bit more like a mollusk than they do an octopus or something.
Yeah, so they have these little hat shells, but they also have 2 of their 8 legs are really big. They're kind of like hands. And so there's these ancient drawings of these creatures, and everyone up until Jeanne thought that they used the shell as a boat and the big hands as a sail.
Honestly, that sounds cool, and I'm going to steal that for a book.
Well, You know who did steal it? Jules Verne.
Villain of the week. Ba-da, ba-da-da. Whoa.
Holy cow!
I should give that a rest, I think. The precise moment when most people click off this video. That was...
Is Jules Verne the villain of the week?
The villain of the week is Captain Nemo.
Okay.
So it's kind of similar that we came across those things independently.
Yeah.
And I, as you know, was struggling for a villain of the week because your suggestion was the patriarchy, and I was like, I don't want to be that person talking about that on the episode. So I was like, I'll choose a fictional villain, Captain Nemo. But then the more I remembered of 20,000 Leagues, it's been a while since I read that one, I realized that he's not actually a villain. He's kind of my absolute role model in life. Yeah. I don't have it exactly, but he was talking about how he doesn't identify with any people. He only identifies with the oppressed sea life. And obviously he changes his name and lives in a submarine very far beneath and collects a bunch of cool stuff and plays the organ very well. So, I mean, can we make him... He's
misanthropic.
He's misanthropic. He's consumed by hate. And the reason that I came to him is because Jeanne Villepreux, she was something of a victim during her life. I mean, maybe not out of the ordinary for a woman living in the 1800s, but as you said, she was kind of turned away by all the scientific societies of the era, which I would think ordinarily or today she would be quite celebrated in. And also there was a story about how on that walk to Paris, she was like mugged and had all her things stolen or something like that. And I was just kind of contrasting what she went on to do with her life with what Captain Nemo kind of shelled himself away and became, really consumed by vengeance towards his wrongdoers, which were imperialists. And I mean, he's not a villain because he does help people, but he's maybe a little bit more of an anti-hero or a tragic figure. I guess shout out Captain Nemo. The other ideas I had were Hank from Finding Dory. Okay. Remember that orange guy?
Yes.
But also he's not a villain. He just kind of has sneaky ways. And also I was trying to find if there were any really famous hunters of sea things, like people who went out and sorted whales and squids and everything like that. But it seemed a little bit dark, so... Yeah,
we're not going to go into the Moby Dick.
No, that's for next week. We'll do an episode on Herman Melville.
So the name of these fairly special octopus, which I kind of want a drawing of now. I'm just really obsessed with them.
Did you see her drawing of them?
Yeah, that's the only surviving drawing of hers.
She was also a weirdly talented
That's the thing.
drawer.
She's just a Renaissance woman. Like her painting, this is the only one that survived of the Argonauts. She always decided to do biological drawings, but have them set in like the right setting. So it's not just like a biological drawing of the octopus. Yeah. It's on some coral.
I like
there's
that.
A starfish beside it.
It made it look like
pretty.
More of a, I don't know, Michelangelo painting or something like that.
And get to it later, but all of her work, all of her paintings were lost in a shipwreck. Very, very...
cinematic.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Maybe we need to make the Jeanne movie. So, they're called Argonauts. Again, another literary reference. She didn't name them, but they were named after the Argonauts in the Greek history, who were the first sailors on the Mediterranean, supposedly, like in this...
Jason and the Argonauts.
Yeah, Jason and the Argonauts. And so they were like, these guys were even before the real Argonauts because obviously they have their boats and their sails. So they named them Argonauts. And I just think that's really fun. They were first named Nautilus because there was a similar looking creature and they kind of thought they were both Nautilus. But then they slowly realized that they were two different species.
I want to pull another lesson from this for the Solacene, which sounds like a really childish one, but it's about overcoming your fears. Because though I am really fascinated and at times enamored with the ocean, it also terrifies me. And I think this is a big part of the fascination, especially the deep. And also, I think just weird creatures creep me out. As you know, I'm quite jumpy. If I see a shadow that I don't quite like the shape of, I will kick it. And spiders, those are a big no. And I think if I were to see eels, Because there's some things that it's like you see pictures of, you can stare at it all day.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other things that when you're around them, it's a different story. And I think these kind of weird squids are one. I think, and octopus. I actually made randomly for this was a high school project to choose our spirit animal.
Mm-hmm.
I chose a squid. I did.
Interesting.
But what I'm saying is that if I was actually around them, I think I would be quite spooked by them. The way they move, they're alien. If imagine if it kind of went onto your wrist and you couldn't shake it off, you'd be creeped out.
I'm especially terrified of squid, octopus, and submarines.
Submarines.
Those are some of probably my biggest fears.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I mean, we don't know if Jeanne was ever spooked by these things. I think most people have at least a hesitation initially. You see these weird alien creatures, and she knew even, or was even less familiar with the sight of them than we are today, ironically. But it's about kind of compartmentalizing said unknowns, maybe literally in compartments or cabinets, and familiarizing yourself with them, learning about them, and you become more comfortable and less scared. And I think it's a good general rule in life or ambition to try to become less scared.
I like that.
Yeah.
Do you want to know what the big hands are used for?
Okay, going back to
the Argonauts. Sorry, I can't get over them. So
can I guess?
Yeah, sure.
Do they play drums?
No.
Oh, I thought if there was like a big ocean jamboree, they'd be the ones going ba 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 ba.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure if we in the movie,
they can of course
play that role.
I mean, that song might be taken, but.
So everyone thought the big hands were used as sails. They thought that the Argonauts stole their shells because when they're born, they're very tiny, and it's like they probably don't really have shells. But actually, what they have is this really tiny. They're born without shells, but then they put the hands over their heads, kind of like a hat, and then secrete shell material. And they make the shells with their hands.
That sounds like a Pokemon.
It's the only creature that does that. Because a lot of them, they make their shells through mineralization, kind of it builds and builds and builds. Yeah. But they just in a few days, they're well, gonna just make this shell, and they do it with their hands. And if it breaks, what do? They'll take the broken piece and they'll heal it with their shell, with their hand. It's just the craziest thing. Very Pokemon, very fake.
I feel like Jeanne might have been lying about that. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, the thing is, she wasn't.
It's been studied afterwards.
Yeah, it's been studied after. It's not she just told everyone that, and it was oh, and they actually are extinct.
Yeah, no, they put their hands over their head and they make it.
Yeah.
What if it breaks? They fix it.
Yeah, that was one of the first experiments she did, was breaking their shells to see what they did.
Ethical.
Well, the thing is, it doesn't hurt them.
How do you know?
It's not a part of them. It's like cutting hair, which you still can't wrap your head around, I know.
I'm convinced that cutting hair hurts. I just have this really infantile fear of the barbershop.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, that was Jeanne. And then in 1843, her and James decided to move back to the motherlands of Paris and London. So they moved from Sicily. They were on a boat, and the boat sunk. They were all fine. They lived long, happy lives. Jeanne lived to be 90, which is kind of crazy as well for that time period. But, good for her. But after the shipwreck, she was pretty well, there goes literally all of my work, all of my paintings, everything. So she just moved into public speaking. So random, but she just started giving lectures and so on. And after this also, because she stopped her work, she still remained active within the scientific community, mainly because there was the aquarium craze, and she started to realize people weren't crediting her with the discovery. And so she actually was friends with Richard Owen, the man who kind of infamously debated Charles Darwin on evolution. So she was friends with him, and he was her proxy within all of the scientific circles. So he started disseminating her papers. He made an entry into the Merriam-Webster dictionary, for the definition of aquarium, her name is included in it, saying she invented it. So he was, that's quite generous, honestly. And so yeah, she was a part of the scientific community through this proxy situation. And she was really one of the first women to ever have a proxy within a lot of these circles, which is pretty cool. And she was a trailblazer
that we know
in many ways. Yeah, exactly.
I guess this is another kind of lesson or just elements that I would like to mention for the Solacene, when I think about this podcast and that ideal future, I think about it in a semi kind of realistic or borderline academic way, but also as a kind of, we mentioned before, biomimicry or like world building fantasy, because I'm more of a fiction author by trade. Can I say that yet? I don't know. And one of the details from her life that has always captured my imagination is these grand scientific societies, like that she was not really a part of, except, as you mentioned, through this man. So one of these, or I think the most famous one, is called the Royal Geographic Society in the UK. And there's also the Explorers Club in the USA, which I think Roosevelt may have been like an honorary member of, or a real member. And there's just something so awe-inspiring about these institutions for science where people sit around and draw squids and have like museums, and it's kind of formal. I think it's very unique to this era of exploring the world. And now, as we were saying, it's not really a thing because we don't really do expeditions to the North Pole anymore. Or if they do, they're kind of retreading ground that's already been tread. But if we could somehow recapture that spirit, and something that caught my eye further is that said Royal Geographic Society in the UK started as just like a very small dinner club that it gradually grew out from as more people started attending. So it's something we mentioned on the podcast before, is the lack of serendipity in a world dominated by digital interactions and the internet as we are in today. But also, I mean, it's also the lack of formal groups and institutions that we can be a part of and meet people, share ideas, basically.
People talk a lot about third places, which this reminds me of, but it's not that we need third places. It's like we need third things.
Third groups.
Because it's like you have your family, you have your
workplace.
Work. But then like for hobbies, you don't really have community. You do a lot of them in isolation. The community is completely online.
Exactly.
And another thing is, it's not like social mobility, but it's almost like organizational mobility, because you say it starts as a dinner club, but now it's like, well, then you're going to need to get funding and apply for grants. But
yeah, it's
like
weird.
Because in order to break through even like the NGO space, you need quite a lot of...
I mean, I'm sure these guys were wealthy.
They probably were wealthy, that's true. But it's just like, I feel like there probably is space for a bit more mobility within organizations to grow, because right now, if you start a dinner club, but then people start coming, how are they going to learn about it, for one thing? But if they do start coming, it's like everyone only has 600 square feet to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's partly what we were saying about ambition and scope, wherein now, at least you and I, if you were to start something like that, you'd feel the need to be like, and here's what we want to do for science. Whereas maybe if it was more of a community, like, let's get together and draw pictures of all the local trees. And then suddenly, while you're doing so, you notice, actually, what's going on with this one? And then you say, you make you start researching it and realizing that nobody knows about this, and you guys can observe it over time. But it's more about just, I suppose, starting not with the intention of making money.
Well, it's like when people always feel like they need to monetize their hobbies. And it's not necessarily monetization in this case, but it's still discovery or like some kind of social change that you feel like you need to enact. It's similar to when we start the podcast. It's like, can't just have a podcast. We have to like do something, make a change the world, which is sure a fun prospect, but not everybody has to have that. You can just have your dinner party, draw your squirrels, post them, maybe put them up on a communal bulletin board, and then that's that. That's
also because what you said, like, how is anyone going to know about it today? That saturation where the society cannot be what actually occupies most of your time. Most of your time has to be keeping up with trends on TikTok so that you can post about the society, which is maybe me ranting a little bit about Solacene, but...
No, it's fine. I feel like you divulge every conversation into built less, but I bring every conversation back to just burning your phones.
Burn the phones. Because
I've been trying really hard lately to literally just not ever pick up my phone. And do you know what? It's working very well. And I'm just like, it's so simple. We need to just do a few episodes on phones probably, but it's just...
Yeah.
it's really liberating, and you have time for your little societies. You have time for your hobbies. Whereas now it's like, I don't have time to do anything. Like, I have to work in Soul Scene all the time. I have to go to my job. I have to do this. But it's just like, when you just stop putting like 4 hours a day into the screens, you suddenly have 4 hours, which over a week, it's like many more hours.
Yeah, I had most of my notes. My notes was just a big drawing of an aquarium, and I kind of labeled it with various aesthetic qualities that I thought could somehow inform the Soul Scene. And really the dominant one was silence. And I think this is one of my main magnetisms toward the ocean world. In the poem, I said perhaps it's just an introvert's paradise, but it's the fact that sound doesn't travel there. And while we're recording this, we have to take pauses every 30 seconds as a massive truck drives by, or indeed a strange man singing opera on the sidewalk.
Yeah, let us know if your community has the opera man, because we have actually two. So,
do we?
Yeah.
It's almost like a Hey Arnoldian archetype.
Yeah, because there's the one who comes by, but there's also an old man with a stick and a dog.
Yeah.
Who likes to sing opera as
well. But it's with the silence, I want to fast. I want to have a stimulus fast.
Mm-hmm.
But like most people, unfortunately, I've boxed myself into where I cannot for professional reasons.
True. I've noticed even in yoga classes, a lot of them play music now. And it's like, I'm literally here to meditate, but there's noise. And of course, noise is useful in meditation settings sometimes, but it's like, does every class need...
I mean, it's two things. One, people don't realize that they have broken their... I don't even like the term attention span, because it's not exactly that, but they've broken their capacity for stillness. And when people do realize that, often it's just like oh, damn, that sucks. And there isn't the realization that just as you broke it, you can fix it.
I think when people realize, they lean into it. It's like, well, my attention span's this.
Exactly.
And then just start only consuming 30-second content.
That's how I feel partially with phone and internet, because we need to do it so much for Solar Scene. It's like, well, I can't really reduce my screen time anyway, so in for a penny, in for a pound a little bit.
I'm having an idea. Perhaps we could do a mini semester where we try try stuff for a week and then report on it. So perhaps we try like 1 week where we have 1 day where we're allowed screens and all the other days we're not allowed them. Or doing like a 30-second window. I don't know.
Maybe you can be the
just
guinea
tossing
pig for
around
that.
Ideas.
So some other notes from my hand-drawn aquarium. The school of fish. It's so inspiring how they move together. And this is not exactly a one-to-one lesson about people should be uniform and all move at the same speed in the same direction. But it's just something about the grace and the neatness with which they're all dressed, for one thing. And they all match, which is lovely. But just the way that they kind of slip through that world, and we feel so ungainly in comparison. I think in the first ever poem for Solar Scene, on the first episode, there was a line something like humans in the world with humble color, treading on stone as if they tread upon the faces of their mother. And that's how I feel fish move, except they don't tread, they just swim. And thirdly, the ocean rock, which just inspires me endlessly. And I don't have it, but recently we went to a small, weird, naturey, urban, Montreal-y event, and there was a lady handing out sprigs and stones and shells. And she was like, oh, do this exercise where you have to really ponder the small natural trinket you've chosen and ask yourself the question, I think this is what she said, it was in French, how can you live in a way which honors this?
Mm-hmm.
And mine was like this small hunk of sea stone, I think.
It was really strange because there were only 2 pieces of the stone on the tray of like a few hundred things. And I was on stage and I was in the audience. And so when we picked our thing, we both picked the 2 sprigs. And I think it's kind of like this fossilized, stone.
But there's something... I didn't have an answer for how I can live to honor this.
Because it's so incredible.
I said it reminded me of bread. But it's something about the shape, the texture, the color, which just makes me want to construct fantastical worlds. And I know you always kind of roll your eyes at that, because every time we're out somewhere in the wilderness and there'll be like a spectacular view, I'll be like, imagine if there was a big giant beneath that tree or something, and then it stood up and the trees were all on its back. But that's just how nature works for me, I guess. And also, aquariums give me the same feeling as Japanese gardens or bonsai, where they shrink a world down to the point that you are like this giant in it, and it gives you a completely different perspective. Because aquariums, I mean, also think about it pre-television, because now you can set your television up to be a 24/7 live stream of the Pacific Ocean or something like that.
Mhm.
But before that, it's just this box that you walk around. You can't go in, so it limits your senses akin to a screen, but it's maybe more consciously, because for me anyway, the whole time I'm looking at an aquarium, there's this yearning where I want to touch that prickly thing, and that starfish looks like it smells so nice, and the coral just looks like flavored sponge. I want to eat that. You know what I mean? Like there's a sense to it that I don't think most television or film has, weirdly enough. Maybe it's because you can walk around it. Like it's not completely flat, and the things are actually there.
It's
but
dynamic. You're interacting with it. We used to
you can tap on the glass.
Exactly. We had cousins who had a really fantastic aquarium, and they had a sea anemone, and you could feed it pieces of lettuce, which is just so weird, but also so cool.
Mm.
I want to say Solacene recommends getting an aquarium, but I'm not 100% sure. I didn't look into the actual ethics for the fish, like how they suffer from it. We went a whole episode saying aquariums are really cool, but I think they seem a bit more humane than zoos because they can be a bit more of a whole ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I also just think that fish are on a lower level of consciousness than our big mammals.
Yeah.
And sea anemones, certainly.
Yeah.
I don't think they would notice, but
they just think they're getting some sweet lettuce treats.
maybe that's a cruel way to end the episode. Do they eat lettuce?
That's what we would feed them. I don't think it's what they eat in nature, but I think lettuce is just the closest thing to seaweed or something like that.
It's like, do they eat lettuce? These ones did.
They did.
Big Macs, chicken nuggets.
Mm-hmm.
They eat anything. Wine. Just pour it in there. Finally, the most abstract point, because I cannot articulate the boat lust properly, is that if you picture like aquatic forms, the strange creatures,
Picturing them.
tendrils, bright orange, the way the starfish move by one leg after another, it's such an alien world. And when you picture those images or see them on television or see them in an aquarium, or one of my real bucket list items to dive, though I'd be quaking with fear probably, you can pretend that it's a world apart from humans entirely. And that sounds super misanthropic, but really it's about plastic. We can pretend that we're not destroying that world, whereas when you see deer, bears, snakes, and desert birds and cactus, I feel like you have this, because they're suffering with us, they're like, oh, damn, these guys are going to struggle just like we do. Whereas with ocean stuff, you think maybe this world will just glide by ignored, even though I know it's not, but you can pretend.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading a little bit about plastic this week, and it just...
That'll weigh you down.
In the Solacene, though,
No plastic.
no plastic.
Yeah.
So that's what this podcast does for people.
Mm-hmm.
They just say, oh, in the Solacene, no plastic.
Yeah.
And then you come away smiling.
Yeah, then you say, today could be the Solacene. No plastic for me.
Whoa, no plastic for me.
Mm-hmm. Great. So thank you all for listening. We appreciate it. This was a very fun episode, and we hope to see you all next week.